Greetings and welcome to the BMES Professional Development webinar entitled BME ABET Program Criteria and Assessment. I'm Ben Kelly and I'll be your moderator today. Today's webinar will focus on issues and topics surrounding ABET EAC evaluation visits for biomedical engineering undergraduate programs, including topics of interest for the BMES assigned program evaluators. I'm an engineering professor at Baylor University, and I also serve as the quality coordinator for the BMES Accreditation Activities Committee. The BMES AAC is charged with leading and interfacing with ABET-related processes for accreditation. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded for your convenience. The slides and archived recording will be available in the next several days through the BMES website on the e-learning page. Next, at any time during this webinar, you may submit questions by using the online chat function to the lower left of your screen. Please submit your questions as we go. Your questions will be addressed by the speakers at the end of the webinar. Lastly, please do not exit the webinar right after the end because there will be a brief evaluation. We would greatly appreciate your feedback, so please take a moment to complete it. We have several polling questions for you. The first, which is present now, and let me read it. And if you would then, please respond appropriately. Which of the following best describes you? As I see the results being tallied, I see that we have PEVs for BMES, of course. We also have almost an equal number of other faculty that are involved in the accreditation process, and I might imagine these would be departmental coordinators for the accreditation process at their institution. And we also have mentors and those with other duties. Now let's go to the second polling question. Please select where your program is in the accreditation process. Now, as I receive those results tallied, we have the large majority of those in attendance today from previously accredited programs and several from initially accrediting programs. And you'll hear later in this webinar that part of the challenge for the BMES AAC is to keep up with the number of new programs requesting accreditation each year as biomedical engineering programs continue to grow and flourish. And then finally, our third and last polling question. What are you hoping to learn from this webinar? And please select more than one if appropriate. Thank you for your responses. We have everyone wishing to learn today, some, a good number, about all of the details of visits and training for PEVs. And we hope we'll meet your needs today as we introduce and discuss some of these kinds of topics. BMES is the lead society for the accreditation process. However, we're not the only society involved, including the American Ceramic Society, AICHE, ASABE, ASME, and IEEE. So sometimes PEVs are borrowed from those other societies representing BMES and ABET during that process, during the accreditation process. As we move through the accreditation process, BMES and ABET work together, coordinate those kinds of activities, and membership in this Accreditation Activities Committee includes several. Some of those assigned to duties are the chair, which you will hear from today, Deborah Wells, the individual who assigns the PEVs and coordinates that with the institutions requesting visits in ABET, and the quality assessment coordinator, myself, and this webinar is a part of that process. There are 4 other members, several ex officio members, including our representatives to the ABET Board of Delegates, and you'll hear from an individual representing that as well. And we have a corresponding member who is chair of the Council of Chairs, which represents the ABET accredited undergraduate biomedical engineering program. Here's a listing of the members of the AAC. You can see it's a diverse group from a number of different universities. And the red stars that you see next to 3 of those names are the individuals that will be interfacing with you today on this webinar. Myself, Ben Kelly, the chair of the BMES AAC, Deborah Wells, and Paul Benkesser, who is one of our representatives to the ABET Board of Delegates. Deborah Wells, the chair of the Accreditation Activities Committee, will be our first presenter today. And she will be sharing with you some of the details about the process and the general criteria. Deborah is the program manager of the Center for Advanced Space and Science, and she is the vice president for product development, Neuroprene. She'll kick this off with the general criteria, and then we'll introduce our second speaker in a few minutes. Ms. Wells.
Thank you, Ben. So what is the Accreditation Activities Committee, and what role do we play in the accreditation process? Well, first of all, you should know that our members have all been PEVs. We've all been evaluators of programs, and many of us come from academic programs that have been accredited. We do also have industry members who are part of our committee, and we are working to diversify both our committee and our PEVs to make sure we're representing the programs that we're accrediting as well as possible. We have several duties. One of those is to look for new program evaluators, and so you'll see us maybe sending out emails looking for people who may be interested, or even talking to one of you to recommend someone from your organization to become a program evaluator. I know actually the gentleman who asked me to be a program evaluator is on the call today. So it's a personal connection who reached out and asked me to perform that function. And if you know anybody who's interested, they can go right to the ABET website, and there is a place on there it says a network of experts. And if you click on that, it'll tell you exactly how to sign up and put in your interest to be a program evaluator. So once we have a good cadre of program evaluators, then our assigner, who's currently from Tulane University, assigns the PEVs based on the schools and the programs that have said they want to be accredited in that accreditation year. So our accreditation year runs from basically August through July. So right now we're in the accreditation cycle that would be called 2016-2017. Those assignments have been made. Those visits are for the most part all scheduled. The self-study packages have been delivered to the PEVs, and the PEVs either have a mentor if they're new, or they have a consultant if they're not a new PEV to help them if questions arise. And those mentors and consultants are from the AAC, or sometimes it's from other experienced PEVs. So our third role is to train PEVs, and ABET does do a full comprehensive training program, and what we do is try to come in and make sure that everybody understands the program criteria and maybe anything that's a little bit different about biomed in the other criteria as well. So our committee meets in January typically every year, and one of the things that we do during that meeting is to review all of the visits that have happened in that accreditation year, and we look for things that everybody's doing well, things that folks need help with, and try to then design what we do the rest of the year around training and improvement and communication to address those things. We also look at the program evaluator assessments. So everyone who goes out on a visit gets an assessment, and we look at those. And just like your boss at your job, we try to give you some feedback about things you're doing well, things that need to improve. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, one of our jobs is to keep the biomedical engineering program criteria fresh and relevant to the community that we're trying to serve with the engineers that we're educating. And so that's also a part of what we do. So on the next slide, you'll see what our program evaluators go through as far as training. They do have an online training that has about 6 modules that has to be completed, and then they do almost like a mock visit during a day-and-a-half face-to-face training workshop that is conducted by ABET. So every PEV from every society goes through this same training, and it involves the subject areas that you see here. So everything from the end-to-end process from beginning to end, all the way through that appraisal process of the PEV's performance that I mentioned. And they give some very good examples. They use examples of programs that have done things well again, and things that may not have been done so well, so that you can try to learn from others' experience. Most programs, when we have findings, there tend to be groupings. There tend to be things that are similar, and so the training helps people to spot, again, good things and things that need improvement in the accreditation process and in the program. And then finally, the society-specific training, which is what this webinar is all about today. So how do we help them? One of the things that we don't do that other societies do, we do not send new PEVs on what we would call an observation visit. Typically what we do is a new PEV that has completed the training is assigned a mentor, and that mentor then can work with them hand in hand, answering questions, having calls before the visit during the self-study review to try to guide them through that first visit. Typically also our assigner will try to put a new PEV on a program that requires 2 PEVs, 2 biomed PEVs, so that way you have kind of that built-in mentor there with you. That doesn't always happen, but we do try to do that. I mentioned the consultants. So every PEV has a consultant that's assigned to them, and so that person's there for questions. However, I want to make it clear that when program evaluators are on a visit, Always the first line of assistance is the team chair and the group that's there doing the assessment. And only if a second opinion or a clarification, especially when it comes to program criteria, is needed, then that consultant can come in and give some second opinion. Okay, so general criteria. As I think everybody's aware, ABET publishes criteria for accreditation. That criteria is a combination of two things. It's the general criteria for all baccalaureate programs, and it's made up of 8 different components. And then you have the program criteria. And BMES is responsible for the program criteria. That's biomedical engineering and other programs called bioengineering. So when you go to the document for ABET, you may see other criteria that look similar. So if you're not sure, you can always look and see the ones, it'll designate the ones that the Biomedical Engineering Society is responsible for. So those are the program criteria we're using. The general criteria are these 8. So students, program educational objectives, student outcomes, continuous improvement, curriculum, faculty, facilities, and institutional support. And I guess, Paul, it's up to you now.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. Paul Benkesser, I'm a professor and senior associate chair in the Coulter Department of Biomedical Engineering at Georgia Tech. And my role in this webinar is to talk with you about the program criteria. So a little bit of background on the program criteria. These criteria are established by the lead societies. In this case, biomedical engineering is the lead society for BME and BioE program criteria. And most recently, about 3 years ago, went through about a year-long effort to revise these program criteria. So if you have not looked at these in 2 or 3 years, you may want to take a close look, as there have been some changes made. The purpose of these program criteria are really to, in some sense, differentiate the different flavors of engineering. In particular, they're going to give a bit more specificity with regards to 2 of the general criteria, criteria 5, curriculum, and also possibly criterion 6, although in the BME BE program criteria we do not make any references to faculty qualifications. But so in the case of the BE, BME program criteria, these are really only going to get additional information or supplementary information on curricular topics, nothing with regards to faculty qualifications. And the very last bullet in this slide is an important one, and I'll touch on in greater length later, but the programs must demonstrate that the program criteria are met, and not leave it up to the program criteria, the program evaluator to figure it out for him or herself. Okay, so the next 2 slides here, we'll go over verbatim what the BME BioE program criteria are, and then I'm going to follow that up with 6 key concepts that I'm going to extract and elaborate on from within these the wording in these criteria here. So these apply, again, only to the bioengineering, biomedical engineering programs, or those that have similar modifiers in their title. And again, we only address curricular topics in these particular criteria. So under curriculum here, we have a requirement that the structure of the curriculum must provide breadth and depth across the range of engineering science topics consistent with program educational objectives and student outcomes. want to just emphasize the presence of the reference here to the program's PEOs and student outcomes. And the remaining section of the program criteria specifies that the curriculum must prepare graduates with experience in these following bulleted areas here. Principles of engineering, biology, human physiology, which is a new addition to these program criteria, chemistry, calculus-based physics, mathematics, mathematics through differential equations, as well as statistics. And then start talking a little bit more about the types of capabilities that, or a little bit more specificity with regards to these topics and what the students have to be able to do with them or demonstrate within their curriculum. Solving biomedical engineering problems, and specific note is made here to including those associated with interaction between living and non-living systems, as well as analyzing, modeling, designing, and realizing biomedical engineering devices, systems, components, and processes. And lastly, must provide experiences in making measurements and interpreting data from living systems. So a lot of words there. Let me try to extract from those some key concepts. And the first is related to that word demonstrate that was I emphasized in my reading earlier. How do you demonstrate that your particular program has met these program criteria? It is very important to recognize that these program criteria are not the same as student outcomes. Okay? These are not student outcomes, and therefore they're not subject to the assessment and evaluation criteria or requirements of criteria 4. Okay? So when we talk about demonstrate here, you must be able to show the program evaluators that the curricular topics that are listed in the program criteria are part of the program's curriculum. I would say that probably most programs choose to not only show course syllabi, but also examples of student work as evidence to demonstrate that these topics are included in the student's program of study. Now there is one exception here that we have to be very careful of and need to be very clear about. Okay? Some programs actually choose to insert some of the curricular topics into student outcomes. Okay? So for example, student outcome A, an ability to apply knowledge of mathematics, science, and engineering. A program might decide, biomedical engineering program might decide, well, let's since they have to have statistics, let's include statistics. So they change their outcome A to an ability to apply knowledge of mathematics, statistics, science, and engineering. If a program does that, then that is an outcome that they must follow criteria for processes and procedures to demonstrate that the students have attained that particular outcome. So there is this exception that if you tend to combine the curricular topics with the student outcomes, then those topics become outcomes and you must assess them as if they were outcomes. But if they only appear in the program, if they don't appear in the student outcomes, then you do not need to assess or evaluate the achievement of. Just simply demonstrate that they're part of the curriculum. Breadth and depth. Okay. This is one that is certainly a subject to interpretation. That the breadth and depth across the range of engineering topics. Okay, so if I were a program evaluator and coming in and taking a look at a particular curriculum, I'm going to first look at the title of the program. Now, the vast majority are bioengineering or biomedical engineering, so that doesn't give me too much insight into any specific depth that might be implied by the title. But there are some programs out there that get very specific, more specific than that, and that may imply a range of depth in a certain subfield within biomedical engineering. So title of program is one place. The other is really the student outcomes, as well as the program's educational objectives. What are you training your graduates to attain after they leave your program? That may give clues in terms of the range of breadth and depth that you are trying to prepare your students with. Could be in program outcomes. You may choose a unique set besides A through K that again may imply certain depth in some areas. So the breadth and depth issue, the interpretation should be guided by the information about the program that the program determines, primarily through its title as well as its educational objectives and student outcomes. Another key concept relates to applying principles and solving problems. So we're looking here, applying principles, for example, of biology and human physiology. Those are very broad descriptors. There is no specific requirements as to what aspects of biology or human physiology. Again, programs have some freedom there to determine what works best for them. It is also important to note that these do not need to be contained in standalone courses. Okay? They could be integrated in other courses. So in other words, if I'm a program evaluator, I'm not necessarily looking for a separate course entitled Human Physiology. Perhaps that subject is incorporated into another biomedical engineering course, in which case I'd have to really look at the syllabi and the information about that course to verify that this particular curricular topic is included in the program of study. Solving biomedical engineering problems, and particularly those associated with interaction of living and living systems. So programs should be prepared to demonstrate that that the curriculum includes these type of application of fundamental knowledge to solving problems, and it is probably most easily done in this particular case by demonstrating or showing examples of student work. The next key concept, differential equations and statistics. Once again, these do not need to be in standalone courses. They could be incorporated as parts of other courses, but you must have through differential equations and must have statistics as part of the program of study that the students are taking. Making measurements and interpreting data. Okay, the statement must prepare graduates with experience in making measurements on and interpreting data from living systems. So the key thing here to recognize is not only is the expectation that the data be measured, but also interpreted or evaluated as well. How a program chooses to demonstrate this is again up to the program, but don't leave it up to the program evaluator to figure it out for him or herself. Provide specific evidence, whether it's examples of student work, syllabi, project demonstrations, whatever you believe is best demonstrates that students are prepared in this manner. The interaction between living and non-living systems. Once again, the problem solving must include problems associated with these types of interactions. These obviously are a broad range of interactions between living and non-living systems. Because there are many different flavors of biomedical engineering programs, there is no specific list of which type of interactions must be addressed. Again, programs are free to determine what meets their needs best and how they're trying to prepare their graduates, and must be prepared to demonstrate that to the visiting program evaluator. I think this one's back to you, Debbie.
Thank you, Paul. So we're going to talk a little bit about common issues on the general criteria. I mentioned that there were 8 of them, and I'm going to just briefly go through these and kind of give you an idea of what are the general findings that are pretty common for each of these. So for students, obviously students have to be advised, and there has to be all the policies and procedures for when they need to change classes and check prerequisites. This also covers checking for trans students. So a lot of the findings that come out of this revolve around that transcript evaluation that the program evaluators have to do. So usually that may lead to some findings here, especially for course changes or transfer students, and then verifying that advising occurred or the proper sign-offs were received for anybody who was out of sequence or taking things maybe without prerequisites and things like that. So there's procedural things here a lot of times that programs will get hung up on, and just making sure that each student has a really good record of the curriculum that they're following, their progress through that curriculum, and documenting any changes for their particular needs is really important. Under 2 for PEOs, one of the biggest things that happens here is that what the program will say are their PEOs is not what is published. So one of the first things a program evaluator will do is go look on the website to see what is there. And if it doesn't match, then that immediately is a flag to be looking in other places to see, is it properly published. And that has to be, and they have to be consistent with the mission of the institution. So everything has to be in alignment, sort of from the university, college level down to the program. Student outcomes. These are what everybody calls the A through K, and this is where the program has to demonstrate that the graduates have met these student outcomes. Now, a program can choose to change these, but you have to be able to map whatever the program's outcomes are back to the A through K to demonstrate that you are meeting A through K. And you also have to show how the program outcomes map to the PEOs as well. Okay, so for continuous improvement, I think one of the things that, this obviously requires the program to be evaluating itself, first of all, be assessing those evaluations against a rubric of goals that you're wanting to meet, and then actually making changes. So an evaluator is going to be looking for all 3 of those things in this process. And so it's good to keep that in mind, but also keep in mind that a program does not have to measure every single one of these every single year. So you can have over a 6-year accreditation cycle, you could be evaluating these every other year, every 3rd year. That's really your choice as to what that process is. It's just, do you have a process, are you following it, and are you closing the loop on that process? Curriculum, obviously there's some very specific requirements here for mathematics, engineering topics, and the general education component. The real issues tend to get in here is to what we're classifying as mathematics, what are we classifying as engineering topics. So it needs to be really clear, the program needs to really be clear about, is this course considered an engineering topic? Is it a mathematics? Is it a basic science? It will make the PEV's job much easier if that's very clear in the self-study. Otherwise, the PEV's got to go figure that out, and sometimes there's disagreement then. But those negotiations and that discussion usually occurs during the visit or just before. This is also where we have the major design experience that's required here. And again, one of the big things that everybody's looking for is this incorporating appropriate engineering standards and realistic constraints. This tends to be a finding across all engineering programs, not just biomed, but it does stand out in biomed as well. Faculty, sufficient numbers, covering all curricular areas, maintaining all the different activities that faculty have, especially in this climate where budgets are very tight. We see this a lot as everything is okay right now, but if something were to happen, it could become a bigger problem for the program. So it's good to have a good understanding of this. What are the pressures on the program? How fast are they growing? Things like that as you look at faculty. Facilities is the same way. There is some wording in here about an atmosphere conducive to learning and appropriate safeguards to keep people safe while they're doing these. And this is also where we talk about library services and IT infrastructure to help promote the students' activities and learning. And then finally, institutional support. It's good in here to listen to your deans and your program chairs about what are the challenges they're having from a financial perspective. And typically right now, as I mentioned, I think all of us are hearing that budgets are tight. How do we do more? How do we keep meeting these criteria? How do we keep adding new things, expanding the curriculum under these constraints? So being creative, maybe doing more things outside of the classroom in particular that can add to these are ways to improve that. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, which is going to talk about common issues for BME. So biomedical engineering, I was lucky I went to a school that had an accredited program a long time ago, but we have a tremendous growth in this area such that I think next year we have, or this year we had 7 new programs and 15 renewing. So we had 50% of the programs, that we visited were, or 50% of the number was new programs. So these are programs, and it's growing. They have a huge exponential number of students coming in. Faculty numbers are potentially just keeping up with the number of students. Facility spaces are tight, and they're struggling with how to provide even just a lecture hall for that many students. Standards, as I mentioned, for biomedical students is a finding that we see over and over again, as well as advising. And the advising goes to, again, the number of faculty that are available to help. Paul or Ben, is there anything else you want to add on this slide that I may have missed?
I think you've covered all of that, Deb, and I do not have anything else to add there.
Okay. Paul, you have anything you want to add on this slide? I'm going to guess that's a no. So, okay, so some basic reminders. PEVs are expected to completely review the self-study before arriving on campus, and that includes filling out the visit day 0 parts of the ABET forms and being prepared to turn those in to the team chair on that first day there. A lot of team chairs will ask for those actually ahead of time, so that they know you've looked at the self-study and actually give the program an opportunity to prepare to answer that first set of questions either before you actually get to the visit or have that information ready to go when you are there for the visit. The accreditation action, so that's what happens at the end of the visit. There's a recommendation by the visit group, the visit team, as to what the accreditation action should be. It is only a recommendation at that point because once the campus visit is over, there is another 9 months of activities that occur. So the site visit is actually kind of almost the beginning because there's all the back and forth and answering the findings that go on over the next 9 months. It's actually not until the summer when the Accreditation Commission meets and then ABET Board meets to vote and agree on the accreditation action that it is final. And just a reminder too that the materials that the PEV, the Program Evaluator, develops as part of that visit are items that we also need a copy of back to the Accreditation Activities Committee because this is what we use to do the evaluation of our PEVs and of any similar problems that programs are having as they go through this process. And finally, it is up to the programs to provide information to show that they've met the program criteria. I think that Paul covered it really well about what's required for the program criteria. It is the way ours are written, it is a curricular requirement, but if you include those in the student outcomes under Criteria 3, then you are required to demonstrate attainment of those. So just be thoughtful about how you use them and be prepared to provide the information as appropriate. PEVs that are going on a visit with a full team need to remember that the program criteria are different for each program. And so issues or concerns, findings that another PEV, say in mechanical or chemical, is raising may or may not be appropriate for your program criteria. So just keep that in mind when you're having your team discussions. And then finally, the program criteria can receive the same level of shortcomings that are applied to the other general criteria, either none, a concern, a weakness, or deficiency, and they have the same definitions as they do when they're being applied to the general criteria. So at this point, Ben, I think I'm turning it back over to you to answer questions that have been posed.
Great. Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Paul. And yes, at this time, we would like to answer some of your questions, and we've had a number submitted in the question chat box, which is at the lower left of your screen. So I will read the question and ask one of our presenters to answer that question. So our first question that has been submitted is, and this has actually been submitted in two different cases. I'll read the first, and it's related to the second question then as well. What type of standards might be utilized in the biomedical engineering senior design project? And Paul, could I ask you to share a few of your thoughts about that, please?
Well, it really obviously depends on the nature of the project itself. And there may well be some types of projects for which very few, if any, standards actually do apply. Most program evaluators are going to be looking for obvious ones. So if it's instrumentation related, there are all sorts of IEEE standards that could apply to the design of any type of electronic instrument. If it has maybe something more mechanical in nature. I'm sure there are another related set of standards in that field that may apply to not only to perhaps testing but also instrument design. But I think it's important to recognize that there may well be certain project areas, particularly those that might be closer to the squishy stuff, biological, regenerative medicine, tissue engineering, those types of things for which the field probably is not developed well enough for many standards to exist. I'm not sure, Deb, whether you have any thoughts on additional examples there or not.
Yeah, my examples are always going to go back to space, but I think each, depending on the project, I think I can see a lot of room for the students and the programs to really drive home how to go find those standards, how to go find what are the most appropriate ones for the project that you're working on, and if nothing else, show the methods that you would use to show that you're meeting those standards. Even just being able to say, I'm testing, or I've got to do tests for this one, or I can do inspection for that one, or what have you. Those kinds of thoughtful processes are things that everyone working at an industry are going to have to go through. I know it was one of the first things that I had to do when I came out of college to work at NASA. So I would really just encourage everyone to kind of push on that a little bit harder. It can be hard, it can be daunting, but the information is there, and with advisory panels who have industry on them, talk to them and get what are you using? How can I find that? How can I understand that? And really encourage the use of that, because it's really important for when they get out of the program.
Great, thank you both. Let's continue with the questions. The next question is regarding prerequisites for courses. If one is missing, would it be ABET's concern if the university's procedures have been followed that is missing the prerequisite, or would that not be in conflict? Deb, could you chat about that? A student missing a prerequisite but yet following some of the documentation advising policies of the university?
So if the decision to skip a prerequisite if there's a formal review process for that, if that's been followed and documented, then I don't see where an evaluator is going to have a finding from that, as long as it's documented why it was missed, and of course, as long as it doesn't show that it impacted the rest of the student's curriculum. But again, that's one case. So it's again, think of this is a general requirement too. I mean, you don't want to see that kind of thing happening routinely either. If they're doing that for every student in the program, that raises it to a different level than if you're just handling that because of one student needing an exception.
Okay, great. Thank you, Deb. Let's go on to yet another question. And the question is, can you talk more about the program's graduation requirements when they may be different from those specific ABET requirements? Paul, can you chat about some of the flexibility there in the program graduation requirements and credits and so forth, and when a conflict might arise between the ABET standards and the institutional and the engineering program's requirements?
Well, under general criteria 5, the curriculum, there is pretty specific information given about the the minimum number of credit hours, for example, math and basic science, as well as engineering. There's also the program criteria that I discussed earlier that has specific topics that must be included in those among those math, science, and engineering hours. But that's really, as far as the curriculum, pretty much all that is referred to in the general criteria, with the exception of the major culminating design experience. So I'm not exactly sure about the question, talking about the program's graduation requirements being different from ABET requirements. There really isn't any wiggle room with regards to minimum engineering hours or math and science, or the presence of the culminating design experience, as well as the curricular topics. Those, you have to satisfy those. And as long as the graduation requirements allow students to well, not only allow, but that the students do obtain all of those, then they're good to go. If they can graduate without those ABET minimums, then the program has got some problems.
Great, thank you, Paul. Let me pose another question that has been presented to us, and I'll take this one. This question is, how is student advising documented? For example, to be PEVs look at transcripts, advising notes from staff, etc. And I would share that first, of course, this is all detailed and explains the process in the self-study that the institution has submitted to ABET and that the PEV is evaluating. And yes, the PEVs definitely do look at transcripts and look at them in quite fine detail. And if there was, as Deb has referenced, a prerequisite or other type of curriculum situation, one case may be looked at in those details if it's identified, and the PEV would expect some kind of advising notes or some kind of justification as to why that prerequisite or other issue was overlooked or somehow circumvented. If it's well documented in the advising notes in an online system, and those seem to be well justified, then I think that's one issue. However, if those types of issues, those types of backups and notes do not exist, and several cases are identified, clearly that has gone to a perhaps different level of concern. So let's continue with our questions. And we have a question here quite relevant from a program perhaps who will be considering applying, asking for an evaluation visit in the future. Should a BME program seeking initial accreditation follow the current A through K outcomes or apply proposed 1 through 7 outcomes? Dr. Ben Kessler, would you please address that?
Sure. The reference in this question is the work that has been ongoing for a number of years to modify the current criteria, criterion 3 and 5. There have been no decisions made with regards to whether the proposed revisions are going to be accepted or not, let alone when they're going to take effect. We should have a little more clarity on that after the ABET board meetings later in October, but I would suggest that any program that is trying to prepare for accreditation, certainly this coming year and probably the next year as well, should stick to the current criteria as far as their preparation activities, but keep tabs on the status of the criteria 3 and 5 work that's ongoing.
Okay. One more question, and Deb, I will ask you to please consider responding to this. If I might summarize the situation, the evaluation and assessment process usually requires something that you measure, or often does, but there's also the possibility that one might use opinion surveys of the students, albeit sometimes those aren't standalone. And what would happen if you encountered the situation where perhaps those student opinion surveys were used as a large majority of the assessment without so much of those quantitative type of data to back it up? Deb, could you please talk to that for a moment?
Right. So if I understand the question right, the question is for student outcomes. So student outcomes, we have to demonstrate that the students have that knowledge. And so what we're asking here is, if all I'm doing is surveying the student, asking the student's opinion of how well they understand something, is that a substantial enough measure for showing student outcome achievement or attainment? And I'll tell you that that would be seen, I think, pretty weakly as a measure for the continuous improvement and demonstration of achievement. Typically, what you're going to want to look for is that a course has been analyzed, and that you show in the syllabus where you're delivering the information on the student outcomes to the students in the form of lectures or labs or however it's being delivered. And then you're showing specific ways that you're measuring the student performance on those topics. So there may be specific test questions that are identified, and so you can, how well did all of my students do on this particular question? If all of them got a 30% on that question, then they're not attaining that knowledge. So that's a much stronger assessment of student outcomes than just a student survey.
Okay, thank you, Deb. And we have time, I think, for one more brief response. And Paul, if you would share briefly about the Capstone Design, what are the details and requirements for that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again? I could not.
The details
could not hear that,
and
Ben.
requirements for Capstone Design are not so well specified. And Paul, could you chat to a moment about how that is the institution's responsibility to show and demonstrate?
Well, the requirements for the culminating design experience are described in the general criteria under criterion 5, if I remember my numbering correctly. And it's talked about in general terms. There's not any specific requirements in terms of how a course needs to be structured. It's simply referring to the elements that must be contained in every culminating design experience for the student. And we've talked about some of these already, including incorporation of standards, relevant standards, appropriate standards, as being one example there. So I would certainly refer back to the general criteria for the specific information on that. The program criteria themselves do not speak directly with regards to anything associated with the culminating design experience.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Please stay online for a moment. Take a few minutes to complete the brief webinar evaluation before you go. We'd greatly appreciate that feedback from you. We'd also like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded for your convenience, and these slides and the archived audio recording will be available on the BMES e-learning page in a few days. You'll be notified by email when that's been posted. We hope you'll join us again for other BMES events. To learn more about those activities and events, please visit www.bmes.org. And again, thank you for your participation today. Goodbye now.